Silence fell like ice over the prestigious Whitmore lecture hall as the esteemed Professor Eleanor Hayes finished writing the equation across the board. She turned chalk dust on her sleeve, scanning the bright young faces with cold confidence. In over 20 years of teaching, not a single student has solved this. Who thinks they can? Nobody dared to raise a hand. The country's supposedly brightest young minds suddenly looked down at their desks. But from the very back, a man wearing a gray janitor uniform slowly raised his hand. Someone snickered. He kept his hand up. Whitmore University sat proudly on a steep hill overlooking the city. Its grand stone buildings oozed decades of ivy-covered prestige and elite academic arrogance. Inside the math wing, the quiet halls smelled of heavy floor wax and paper. Late at night, long after the lectures ended and the campus coffee machines went cold, a solitary figure walked through the empty corridors with just a mop bucket and heavy keys. Adrian Cole had worked the quiet graveyard shift here for nearly 4 years. He worked from 10 at night until 7 in the morning, and the elite professors never learned his name. The few who noticed just called him Cole, treating him like part of the furniture. Every weeknight at 10 he arrived to clean lecture hall 2. At that hour the blackboards were still covered in complex math formulas. Dusty, half-erased equations blurred together across the dark slate. Before wiping them clean, Adrian always stopped to study what was written there, silently reading every single line, pondering the difficult equations the way some men might turn a lucky coin in their hands. He carried a cheap, worn notebook in his back pocket. Sometimes, when the entire building was completely empty, he would sit in the dim third row, quietly copying the advanced equations just to see if he could solve them. On other nights, walking home along Cromwell Avenue at 4 in the morning, he would rework the complex formulas in his head to the rhythm of his footsteps. But he had not always carried a mop. There was once a very different life, filled with promising graduate applications, elite scholarships, and bright dreams. An old professor who called him the most brilliant and original mind in the entire department. But then a sudden illness struck his family, followed by a funeral, and then the kind of medical bills that forced him to sacrifice his academic dreams just to survive. He came to Whitmore because the late night shift paid $18 an hour, leaving his days free to handle responsibilities that fell solely on his shoulders. He no longer wore a wedding ring, but the faint line of pale skin on his finger had never truly faded. Professor Eleanor Hayes was viewed as an academic monument, kept for the exact same reason as historic portraits. Her elite status reminded the wealthy university of what it believed it represented. She published major work at 26, running the entire department by age 40. Now at 53, she deigned to teach just a single undergraduate course each term. That advanced class was feared and legendary. She took pride in failing more brilliant honor students than any other teacher in campus history. She was proud of shutting doors on minds she deemed unworthy. It was a Tuesday morning when everyone's assumptions shattered. Adrian was still working, a full hour after his janitorial shift ended. A pipe above the hallway by Lecture Hall 2 started leaking before 6 a.m. So his supervisors asked him to stay past 7 to help. He had to clean up the water damage and clear ruined ceiling tiles. By the time he finally wrapped up his work, the classroom next door was already filling with students for the 8:30 session. He walked into the back of the lecture hall to gather his remaining supplies, just as Professor Hayes strode through the main entrance. Adrian quietly turned to leave, but she was already writing on the board, and the sharp sound of chalk kept him frozen there. She wrote without even looking back. The complex equation stretched across the blackboard, running from the top left corner almost to the bottom right. This was no ordinary textbook problem. Adrian recognized its true difficulty within seconds. The math structure was highly unusual. It was a rare mix of math concepts that defied every standard textbook formula. When she finally finished, the room of 40 elite students fell totally silent. She set her chalk down, turned to the room, and brushed the white chalk dust from her sleeve with her hand. "I want you to look at this very carefully," she said. "This problem has been on the board of my office in one form or another for over 10 years. I have given it every year to the sharpest minds this school admits. Graduate students, Fulbright scholars, even a prodigy last year who already published in 2 peer-reviewed journals. And not one of them has solved it. She let her superior gaze sweep slowly across the rows of privileged faces. In more than 20 years of teaching, I have never seen anyone get past the 3rd line without making a mistake that collapses the rest of the proof. So who thinks they can? Not a hand moved. Standing in the back shadow of the hall, Adrian felt his own breath grow shallow. He had seen this problem before, just in a slightly different form. But he knew its shape, the bones underneath. He had been quietly working on this exact concept for almost 2 years. Quiet hours past midnight, writing in a notebook he never showed to anyone. He knew exactly why the standard academic approaches failed. He knew why every elite student Hayes had tested had always failed. He knew what it looked like for a man in a janitor's uniform to raise his hand in a room full of privileged university students. He stood there, thinking for a long moment. He stared at the dirty mop bucket at his feet, the heavy keys on his belt, and the pale band on his calloused finger. And then, without even deciding to, he raised his hand. The student in the row ahead turned, a boy in a navy sweater boasting the elite university crest on his chest. His face twisted with confusion, then amusement. And finally, a look of pure embarrassment on Adrian's behalf. The boy smugly elbowed the student next to him. A blonde student sat with her laptop open to a page of neat notes. She looked up at him, glanced back at her screen, and giggled. It wasn't even a mean laugh, which actually made it much worse. It was the easy chuckle of someone enjoying a joke she never saw coming, glad for a sudden break in the heavy classroom tension. Her giggles spread. In just seconds, half the lecture hall turned around to stare. A tall student near the front, someone Adrian had noticed in the hallways before. A highly arrogant guy named Tyler Brennan. Widely considered the smartest student in the class, he let out a sharp scoff of disbelief, whispering something to the girl next to him that Adrian couldn't catch. More students joined in. Some sneered, some looked confused, while others just shook their heads. But up at the chalkboard, Professor Hayes didn't join the laughter. She studied Adrian the way a surgeon evaluates an unexpected shadow on a scan, with cold, sharp curiosity. Her gaze slid from his face down to his uniform. She stared at the ID badge on his pocket, then looked right back at his eyes. "You work here," she said. It wasn't a question at all. She was simply defining his status, laying it out like a barrier between them for the whole room to see. "Yes, ma'am," Adrian replied, his voice far steadier than he actually felt. "And you believe you can solve this problem?" "I can try," he replied, and something flickered in her eyes. It wasn't respect yet, but it wasn't quite mockery either. It was the look of a person who had just been handed, after years of predictability, a variable she never saw coming. She glanced at the chalkboard, then down at her watch. Then she looked at the rows of students, who were watching her just as closely as they watched him. She stepped away from the chalk tray, gesturing with an open palm toward the complex math. "By all means, Mr. Cole," she said, "step up." Adrian placed his mop bucket against the wall and walked up the center aisle. The overhead fluorescent lights felt blindingly bright all of a sudden, and the short distance from his spot to the board felt miles longer than it actually was. He walked past Tyler Brennan, who made no effort to hide his smug grin, and that blonde student who was already holding up her phone to record him. By the time he stood at the front, his hands stopped shaking. He wiped his palms against his blue-collar uniform and picked up a piece of white chalk. Professor Hayes stepped off to the side, folding her arms. She didn't retreat to her podium or sit at her desk. She stood just 3 feet away, close enough for him to hear her breathing, and watched intently. Her silent message was obvious. She wanted to scrutinize every line he wrote, ensuring every student in that room saw her doing it. Adrian stared at the complex equation one last time. He didn't begin where an ordinary student would have started. He bypassed the standard formulaic shortcut that the first few lines of the problem seemed to suggest. Instead, he calmly drew a bracket underneath. This ordinary man stepped up, rewriting a single term in the middle. He reshaped the whole framework before even touching the core math. A quiet murmur rippled through the front rows. Tyler Brennan leaned forward on his elbows, staring. "He is rewriting the function," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "That is not even the right variable." One of the top students, Megan Prescott, let out a mocking laugh and shook her head in dismissal. Down in the second row, another student whispered a joke that got a smirk. Professor Hayes remained absolutely silent. Her eyes never left the board while Adrian quietly kept working. He chalked a second line beneath the first, then a third. Every step moved further away from the standard form of the original equation, diving deeper into a brilliant structure of his own. The chalk clicked softly against the blackboard. He felt sweat pooling at the small of his back, not from fear but pure concentration. It was the same intense focus from his younger years, a previous life of study he had long tried to forget. By the fifth line, the tone of the whispers in the hall began to shift. The arrogant laughter had thinned. Megan Prescott slowly lowered her phone a few inches. Next to Tyler sat Caleb Whitaker, a gifted student who was now staring intensely at the board. He leaned forward, a deep crease forming between his eyebrows. As one of the brightest minds in class, he was rarely confused. But he just realized he had no idea what this outsider was doing. And he also suddenly realized that his own ignorance did not mean Adrian was wrong. Adrian reached a critical step where any normal textbook would demand a specific formula. It was a standard trick that every math textbook in the country would use right here. But he bypassed it, writing instead a custom transformation that treated the entire left side of the equation as one single unified object. He drew a clean line across the chalk and started fresh right beneath it, reconstructing the entire problem from scratch. This was the turning point. He could feel the stunned silence of the crowd as clearly as the math taking shape before him. The lecture hall, once filled with arrogant mockery, had transformed into something entirely different. It was now a room of pure awe. Even Professor Hayes had uncrossed her arms. Her right hand drifted up to her mouth. She pressed her index finger against her lips, transfixed. It was the look she gave when a research paper actually managed to surprise her. Caleb Whitaker was the first to break the silence. He leaned toward Tyler, his eyes completely glued to the blackboard. He is not using the standard formula. He is rebuilding the entire thing from the ground up. Tyler, jaw tight with disbelief, did not answer. Someone in the back whispered, "Is that even allowed?" Another voice quietly replied, "If his math works, it is allowed." I heard their whispers like distant traffic on a busy street. I had entered that deep mental space where this complex problem was the only thing in the world, and this simple chalk was the only tool I needed. I reached a step that required me to expand a bracket. And I did it quickly, like a routine task I had practiced countless times, then moved on. Then I made a mistake, a tiny one. It was the slip a tired working man makes 15 minutes into a proof I had carried in my head for 2 years. I carried a negative sign incorrectly across a transformation, turning a subtraction into an addition 3-line above where I was working. For a moment I did not notice. I kept writing, and the next 2 lines, built on that slip, drifted away from the shape my proof needed. Megan Prescott caught my slip before I did. She sat up straight and spoke, not quite shouting it, but loud enough for Professor Hayes to hear clearly. "The sign is wrong. On the 4th line, the sign is wrong." Heads turned. Privileged students eagerly began to check. Tyler Brennan, whose annoyance at my sudden competence had been highly visible, now leaned forward with a look of pure relief. "She is right," he muttered. He flipped it. "The whole thing collapses from here." The room's chatter started rising. It was not the light laughter from earlier. Something far more hostile. The smug confidence of bright, privileged kids who spent their entire lives being rewarded for catching an outsider's mistakes. I slowly lowered my chalk and stared at the 4th line. I saw it. Professor Hayes stepped forward half a step. "Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was not unkind, but she spoke with the pity of an academic who assumed a working man would inevitably fail, and who wanted to end this demonstration cleanly before it turned into something cruel. "Perhaps this would be a good place to stop. You have gone further than most. There is no shame in," but I did not look at her. I just stared at the board. I could feel their judgmental eyes burning into my back. The phones lifted, the smirks returned, and the professor waited for me to accept the easy escape she had offered. I thought for a brief, clear moment about my drive home, about my janitor's uniform in the wash, about how quickly a story like this would spread through campus by morning. and about how painful it would feel to push my mop past these smug students in these same halls for the rest of my time here. I did not answer her. I simply raised my chalk again. The lecture hall fell instantly silent, a quiet far more intense than any that had come before. I looked at the fourth line, then at the seventh. Then studied the structural rebuild I had drawn beneath the horizontal rule. My jaw tightened and then it slowly relaxed. I placed the chalk back onto the tray. Tyler Brennan let out a quiet, mocking laugh. "That's it," he whispered to Caleb. "He knows he's finished." Several elite students packed up, assuming this working-class man was finally done. Megan Prescott lowered her phone, dismissing him. She was already composing a mocking caption about this foolish janitor's public failure. But Adrian just stood there, ignoring their elitist, superficial judgments. His minor mistake was not the real issue. Looking at the entire structure together, his brilliant mind saw that the sign error was just a surface issue. The real problem was that his beautiful, elegant mathematical rebuild had steered him away from the most perfect path. He had focused so much on avoiding obvious methods that he chose a difficult route that was valid, but not brilliant. Fixing the sign would let him easily complete the complex proof. But that would be a clumsy basic solution, good enough for average students, but not for him. The professor watched, completely misreading his quiet brilliance. She stepped forward gently, looking down on him, and said, "Mr. Cole, please take your seat. You have done nothing to be embarrassed by." From the front rows, a privileged student let out a patronizing laugh. A pitying chuckle, worse than mockery because they truly believed he was beneath them. Unfazed by their low expectations, Adrian slowly grabbed the eraser. He did not turn around or offer them a word. He lifted the eraser to the blackboard and, one clean sweep, wiped away the work they all thought was his limit. The entire lecture hall fell silent. Phones were raised again. Skeptical minds suddenly paid attention. The stunned professor took a step back, her fingers falling away from her mouth. And for the first time since this humble blue-collar worker had raised his hand in the back, she saw him not as a janitor or a brief amusement, but as an intellectual force she could not measure. He set the eraser down and confidently gripped his chalk again. The blank slate before him was a canvas ready for a mind they had all underestimated. He ignored the staring eyes behind him. Standing tall, this man of secret genius let out a slow, calm breath, ready to show them his true, undeniable capacity. He began rewriting from the middle line. His first attempt was merely a standard academic path. This new path was dangerous. This was the masterwork he had designed at 2 a.m, working alone in the quiet lecture hall after his long shift, and refined during his long walk home, where no elite academics could watch him struggle, fail, and ultimately succeed. He had never known if his logic would hold. Now, he would prove it to 40 skeptical students and a biased professor who wanted nothing more than to put him back in his place. His hand swept across faster now. This attempt was no simple correction, it was a total reframe. He did not view the equation as a simple textbook problem, but as a shadow of a deeper, beautiful reality, and he began drawing that hidden structure. Within 4 lines, this unsung genius reshaped the problem in a way they had never imagined. Caleb Whitaker slowly set his backpack down on the floor, unable to look away anymore. The prestigious professor stepped closer to the blackboard. Her arms were no longer crossed defensively. She slid her reading glasses on, forced to study this unexpected genius and his brilliant math line by line. Silent and stunned, her lips moved faintly as her academic mind traced his logic. She refused to step back. Behind her, the entire lecture hall fell so completely silent that the faint hum of the vents filled the room. This self-taught mind reached the critical bridge where both sides of his proof had to meet. And he paused. Just for a single breath, because he had never actually written this calculation on paper. He had only worked it out during long walks on Cromwell Avenue, solving complex math in the dark. He wrote the step, it held true. In the 3rd row, a student named Rachel Ford let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, a sound somewhere between shock and awe. Tyler Brennan was no longer smirking. He went totally still, the color draining from his face as he realized what Adrian was accomplishing. Realizing line by line that his own elite education could never have solved this. Adrian confidently penned the final 3 lines. He did not rush. The final line was beautifully simple, closing the massive proof with a sense of quiet inevitability, as if the truth had been hidden there all along, waiting for a brilliant mind. It just took someone with the courage to question the obvious path. He placed the chalk down but refused to step back from his masterpiece. He just stood there calmly and waited while a stunned silence took over the prestigious room. Professor Hayes stared over her reading glasses, rereading his brilliant logic from the top. Her eyes scanned the first complex equations, then his brilliant restructuring, and finally those last steps. She read through it once, then examined it again. Reaching the bottom of the board again, she slowly removed her glasses and held them in her hand. "Mr. Cole," she began. Her voice was cautious, like someone forced to carefully choose their words in front of an audience. "Would you please stay at the board?" She walked over to her desk, picked up her digital pen, and worked through his math on her tablet. The glowing projection flickered to life on the wall of the lecture hall. The students watched in absolute silence as she checked every step of his math. She compared her work directly to Adrian's solution. She looked up at him with an expression that was no longer condescending, but filled with growing respect. It was the look of an elite academic realizing she had severely underestimated this man's raw intelligence. Once she finished, she set her digital pen down with the same slow precision she had used to challenge the room. Turning to her stunned classroom, she announced, "The proof is correct." The heavy silence broke, but not with cheers or applause. Instead, it was a collective wave of humbled shock. Gasps of disbelief echoed, and chairs scraped the floor as these privileged students scrambled to see the math clearly. Megan Prescott had stopped recording her video, too stunned by this underdog's brilliance to resume. She just stared now, completely ignoring the phone lying face down on her desk. Professor Hayes kept right on talking, admitting that his work was more than correct. "It is better than any answer I have received in all my years of teaching this course." Her soft voice echoed through the silent room. "The textbook solution for this equation requires 14 pages of complex published proof and relies on a classic theorem from 1984, which was once its own doctoral thesis, yet Mr. Cole solved it on a whiteboard in under 30 minutes without using that theorem. He used a brilliant shortcut I have never seen before." She stared right at him. "Where did you learn this?" The self-taught genius hesitated to answer. He looked at his work, the elite students, and his own calloused hands, covered in white chalk dust. "I am mostly self-taught," he quietly replied. "An old teacher got me started a very long time ago. The rest I figured out myself. No school names, no fancy background, just pure talent. You and I know they wanted a privileged backstory, but he offered them nothing." One wealthy Ivy League student slowly stood up. He stood with the rare humility of a person who realizes their expensive education just got schooled by raw talent. "I am sorry," he muttered as the entire lecture hall turned. His face turned bright red. "For laughing earlier, I am sorry." The humbled student sat down without waiting for an answer. His classmate gave him a silent nod, the ultimate sign of respect from one 19-year-old to another. The professor walked to the front, staring at the work of this unlikely genius. She closely examined the bold line he had drawn, the clean spot where he courageously wiped away his mistakes to start fresh. "May I ask you just one more question, Mr. Cole?" "Yes, ma'am. Why did you erase everything after that tiny sign error? You could have easily fixed it and finished. It would be longer, but it still would have worked." She was not trying to trap him. She genuinely wanted to understand his mind. The quiet outsider looked at the chalkboard. "Because a messy, longer proof is not the same as the correct proof," he explained. "I realized halfway through that I was not taking the most elegant path. I only chose that path because I wanted to show up the academic textbook. That is not a real reason. Erasing it was not about the mistake. It was about finding the most beautiful starting point." The professor stared at the brilliant outsider for a while. Her strict academic composure, held through the entire class, finally softened just a single degree. Realizing that true brilliance defies credentials, she nodded to herself and turned around. "Class is dismissed," she announced. "Read chapters 9 and 10 for Thursday, Mr. Cole. If you have some time, I would like to talk with you in the hallway." The shocked students did not move right away. They pack their bags very slowly. We often see arrogance shattered like this, leaving them forever changed by an unexpected genius. Many looked back at Adrian with newfound respect, realizing credentials do not define intellect. Megan Prescott stopped at the end of the front row, whispering softly, "That was incredible." "I am sorry," I laughed. Adrian simply nodded his head. He did not have a response that felt completely honest, so he offered her a silent, knowing look instead. As the room emptied, let us watch how the professor closed the door to apologize in private. The hallway was completely silent. Bright morning sunlight fell in long rectangles across the polished floor. She stayed completely silent until they walked a few steps away from the lecture hall. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I offered you a seat twice. I tried giving you an escape route because I foolishly believed that I was being kind. I was not being kind, I was being purely condescending. I judged you solely by your low status, and I was completely wrong." Adrian listened quietly, taking his time to respond. "You didn't know me," he said softly. "It wasn't an unreasonable assumption. It was mistaken but not completely crazy. It was both," she insisted. "I have worked in this building for years and seen incredibly brilliant minds walk through these doors. I have also seen many people praised as brilliant when they only possessed impressive academic degrees. I should know the difference by now. I have no excuse." They took another few steps. She paused by the window where thick ivy covered the old stone, staring quietly out at the view. "A funded research position is opening up in my department this fall," she offered. "It pays a modest salary, but it is fully funded. You would not even have to leave your current job immediately. It would only require you to do meaningful work under my supervision at a desk in an office with your name on the door. If you want this opportunity, I would love to be the one who recommends you." Adrian did not reply to her immediately. You and I can picture him staring at his uniform, the very thing that made everyone underestimate him. He thought about his long drive home, his broken washing machine, and his daily heavy burdens. He remembered the math notebook in his pocket, and that professor who wrote to him decades ago, calling him the most brilliant, original thinker in the entire department. He realized how incredibly long it had been since anyone acknowledged his intelligence instead of his job. "I am interested," he said. "Good," replied Professor Hayes. "Then come to my office this Friday at 3 p.m. We're whatever you want." She offered him her hand, and he took it. The handshake was quick and firm, carrying far more significance than any of their spoken words. He walked back inside the empty classroom to gather his cleaning bucket and keys. The blackboard was still completely covered with his work. He stood studying his work, looking closely at the two halves of his proof, the abandoned mess above the line and his brilliant solution below, before grabbing the eraser and wiping it clean. He cleared it just like he had wiped 1,000 other boards on previous nights. Moving with the same unhurried pace, his expression entirely calm and unreadable. He stepped outside the university hall and welcomed the cold morning breeze. The university was waking up around him, filled with students carrying heavy backpacks. A groundskeeper cleared the grass with a loud leaf blower. No one passing him would ever guess his brilliant mind, proving how easily we misjudge people by their cover. He walked his usual hallway, carrying his cleaning bucket exactly like any ordinary janitor would. But under that work uniform, his heart felt completely different now. A quiet realization that took hold while he wiped the chalkboard clean. And this feeling wasn't about showing off. It felt like a locked door, one shut tight by his circumstances, was finally starting to open. Back in the empty lecture hall, the prestigious professor watched him through the window. She no longer judged Adrian Cole simply by his blue cleaning uniform. She didn't see him as some strange lucky fluke, or an amusing story to entertain her elite academic peers. Instead, she saw him the same way she viewed the absolute brightest minds she knew, the rare people who actually challenged her own understanding. She suddenly realized with total clarity that fancy titles and university degrees never dictated who was worth listening to. That was the most important lesson her classroom offered all morning. And she, the brilliant professor, was the one who needed the education. True intelligence does not care about your uniform, your status, or where you sit in a room. Brilliance simply belongs to anyone who is willing to step forward and show their mind.